Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically about the survivor for the Ringu Chapter, Yoichi Asakawa. Dead by Daylight has had a pretty odd year by all accounts. 3 of our 4 killer releases were licensed, we've had 3 of those horrible maps in the game's history, and a new matchmaking system arrived, to pretty much universal criticism by the player base. But we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And hidden among all the controversies, I think there's one new character who we perhaps all slept on when he got released. I'm going to make a statement now that might be a bit controversial. I think Yoichi Asakawa is the best licensed survivor in terms of story that we've ever had. Before I talk about why I'm so sure about this, a brief reminder that this video, alongside everything on the channel, is brought to you by Wraith Energy, your one-stop shop for sugar-free and delicious gaming supplements to deliver long-lasting energy without the crash. If you want to check out Wraith for yourself, use the link in the description and my partner code PIXEL20 at checkout to get 20% off your order. I'd also like to thank my patrons on Patreon, especially my new patrons Rage and Megan Ruggiero for your support that helps keep the lights on here. To properly convey why Yoichi is such a great character, I should probably start by answering a question that I'm sure basically everyone here who hasn't seen Ringu would love to hear. Who the hell is Yoichi? To find out, we need to look at not just the original Ringu movie, but the sequel Ringu 2, in which Yoichi was a much more prominent character. In the original film, Yoichi's mother, the journalist Ringu Asakawa, raises Yoichi on her own after separating with his father Ryuji. But both of them remained on somewhat cooperative terms with each other because of their mutual love for their son. But their lives change forever, when Ringu begins to investigate the suspicious death of her niece Tomoko Oishi, who died at the same time as several of her friends exactly a week after they shared a rental cabin together. Ringu discovers the group watched a mysterious unmarked videotape during their stay, and upon watching it herself is unwittingly struck with the curse of Sadako Yamamura. The first person she contacts is her ex-husband, for whom she makes a copy of the tape at his insistence. Now the countdown begins. They have a week to save each other's lives before the curse of Sadako claims them. Once the two of them find out where Sadako came from and where they should be going next, Ringu's first priority is keeping Yoichi safe and not letting him get involved. As such, she takes him to his grandfather Koichi to stay with him for a while, both as a way to keep him out of the way, and potentially to leave him in Koichi's care permanently if the worst was to happen to Ringu and Ryuji. But in trying to save him, Ringu ends up dragging him into the horror in the worst way possible. In his sleep, Yoichi hears the voice of his cousin Tomoko, telling him to reach out to her and watch the tape. This leads to possibly the most memorably horrifying scene in the movie. Ringu waking up to see him in front of Koichi's TV, the tape playing in front of him. Yoichi brought the curse onto himself, hearing the voice of his cousin from the afterlife and driving Ringu and Ryuji to keep going not just for their own lives, but to save their son too. This comes to a head when the pair are dredging Sadako's corpse up from the well and Ringu almost gives up, fatigued beyond measure and almost resigning herself to her fate at Sadako's hands. What keeps her going isn't her own desire for self-preservation, but love for her son and a desperation that even if she dies, she'll do so saving him. And it's what makes her discovery of Sadako's body at the bottom of the well such a powerful flood of emotions, because she saved him too. That hug as she holds Sadako's body close to her, that's not Sadako she's holding close, but her own son, the life that she saved. Or at least, so she thinks at the time. When she figures out she's safe from the curse, it's a massive relief as the film's plot seems to be resolved. But with the death of Ryuji at the hands of Sadako, Ringu realises that just because her body is buried doesn't mean the curse is done. If Ringu was a solitary figure, this revelation wouldn't really matter that much. After all, she's safe. But Yoichi saw the tape too, and if the curse isn't broken, then he's still in danger. This leads to the film ending on a pretty bittersweet cliffhanger, with Ringu driving back to her father's house with the Sadako tape and a big favour to ask him. That's how the first film ends, with Ringu about to condemn her father to death to save her son. The logical conclusion of a theme of generational guilt that Ringu is all about. I went into this briefly at the end of the Sadako video, but crucially this is a theme that was barely present in the books that the Ringu movies are based on. In the original book, the protagonist Raiko is replaced by Yoichi Asakawa, a friend of Ryuji's whose wife and daughter watch the tape and become his motivation to break the curse. But crucially, Sadako is much more of a sympathetic character in the books. Her backstory is drastically changed, and she communicates more directly with the other characters. In the books, Sadako was raped by a doctor at a hospital she was visiting before he killed her, and the whole story takes on a rape and revenge kind of tone. A bit like I Spit on Your Grave from Beyond the Grave. Ryuji, who's implied to be a psychopathic rapist in the book, is killed by Sadako, and Kazuyuki trying to save his family represents the flip side of that same patriarchy that allowed the doctor and Ryuji to get away with what they did. That paternal protectiveness caught in the middle of a horrifying story of revenge. Sadako's vengeful nature is preserved in tradition to the screen, but changing the context of Sadako's death changes how Raiko and her relationship with Yoichi are understood. In the film, Sadako isn't killed by a doctor, but by her own father, after using her powers ends up driving her mother to suicide. While vengeance is still her primary motive, this does change the subtext behind her, away from a rape and revenge story and towards this generational trauma, where the sins of the father are carried down by the children and passed on from generation to generation like the curse spreads. A vicious cycle that you are only spared from by passing it on to somebody else. In this way, Yoichi and his relationship with Raiko becomes a mirror to Sadako and her relationship with her father. Both are powerful psychics who had perilous childhoods as a result of their parents' ambitions and desires to find the truth. Since Sadako's father was a doctor who fell in love with her mother while he was trying to find proof of the existence of psychics. But while Sadako was a victim of her father's grief and the two came to blows, driving Sadako's campaign of vengeance from beyond the grave and creating the curse, Yoichi is an example of a child whose parents tried their best to spare him from that pain and sacrificed themselves for him, unlike Sadako's father, who sacrificed her for himself and the memory of his wife. While this remains largely as a subtext for most of the original Ringu film, this similarity between Yoichi and Sadako becomes an explicit core part of the film's sequel, Ringu 2. Or at least one of the sequels. It's complicated. Ringu technically has two direct sequels. Rasen, translated in English as Spiral, nope, not that one, which is more directly based on the book that followed the original Ringu novel, and Ringu 2, which functions independently from the book and follows the characters and ideas from the first movie more closely. Rasen kills off Raiko and Yoichi before the movie's events and follows Mitsui Ando, Ryuji's coroner, and Mai, Ryuji's assistant from the first movie. It tries to adapt the Rasen novel as closely as possible, with Sadako trying to use Mai's body to resurrect herself by using Mai as a host, and ends with her resurrecting Ryuji for helping her do this, which, as a plot point, works way better in the book than does in the film. Various ideas in the book, like the aforementioned theme of sexual violation and the spread of Sadako's curse more like a psychic virus, makes this make sense. But attempting to apply that to original film logic and themes caused Rasen to fall apart and be generally received pretty badly by viewers and critics alike. As such, a second official direct sequel to Ringu, Ringu 2, was made, bringing back much of the original cast and themes from the film it was being a sequel to. In this movie, Yoichi became a central character, as he, Raiko, and several supporting characters from the first movie like Mai, Sadako's uncle Takashi, Tomoko's friend Masami who watched her die, and Raiko's colleague Okazaki tried to put Sadako's spirit to rest and free Yoichi from her influence. As the movie continues, it becomes clear that Yoichi was in a way possessed by Sadako, as the psychic powers he was implied to have in the original film become much more powerful, to the point that he almost kills a police officer with them in a way that anyone who's seen Sadako's Mori in Dead by Daylight will be able to recognise. The climax of the film follows Sadako's uncle and Mai exorcising Sadako from Yoichi, and eventually Yoichi is saved by the arrival of Ryuji's ghost, who drains away Yoichi's fear and allows him and Mai to overcome Sadako for good. But the ending shows us something that's central to understanding Yoichi's lore in Dead by Daylight. Just because Yoichi is able to move on for now from the guilt and trauma, doesn't mean it's gone for good. That's what Kanai's haunting of Okazaki at the end is. He condemned her to death by refusing to help her with her tape, so her ghost is coming back at him for revenge just like Sadako did. It reminds us that guilt and trauma are not evils to be defeated like a Dark Lord, they lurk within each of us, and it's up to us to confront and survive them so we can get closure and move on. That's what Yuichi manages to do after the events of the sequel. His father guides him from beyond to let go of his fear and pain and guilt and live his life free of Sadako's influence. And that brings us to Yoichi's lore in Dead by Daylight, which continues directly on from that. Yoichi's story starts with him having moved on from the deaths of his parents and the trauma Sadako caused, and he's made something great of himself. He studied to become a marine biologist, a career pretty fitting for him, but it all went wrong for him when a couple of his students went missing on the island of Izu-Ushima, Sadako's childhood home. As the guilt and traumatic memories of his childhood flooded back to him, Yoichi saw Sadako in his nightmares. If you read Sadako as a manifestation of everything he thought he could leave behind, all that guilt and trauma from losing his parents, it's actually a really clever metaphor for how trauma can linger with you, and how it doesn't take much to bring it bubbling back to the surface. Like, when you lie awake at night and think of the most embarrassing or painful moments of your life completely out of nowhere, those intrusive thoughts. Yoichi might be free of Sadako's curse, but that doesn't mean he's free from her shadow looming over his life. He dedicated himself to researching cryptozoology, folk tales, anything that could help him prepare for Sadako's return or ease his uncertainties. And that obsession destroyed the life he built for himself. The university fired him, his reputation was in tatters, and the only place willing to support his new ventures was the news firm his mother Raiko used to work at. He follows the trail of evidence to a remote archipelago off the coast of Scotland, and sets out guided by the spirit of his father to close the book on this whole sorry saga once and for all. But when he arrives, he learns something that I think displays a level of thematic awareness that I didn't expect from a story like this, especially not one written by Behaviour. These disappearances that he attributes to the return of Sadako don't appear to be her work at all, or at least not her working alone. He heads for the island, but there's no indication that Sadako was ever present there. No tape, no contorted bodies frozen in screams of terror. Instead, Yuichi finds something much worse. The storm shatters the boat against the island's rocks, and Yuichi staggers to his feet to see his father beckoning to him from the lighthouse gallery. He tries to follow him, but the rising water and thickening dark fog swallow him, and the entity claims Yoichi Asakawa for its own. Before I move on, I just want to elaborate on the idea that whatever happened to these disappeared people probably wasn't Sadako's doing. I love the idea that Sadako's involvement and the consequences that would mean for Yoichi were mostly figments of his imagination and own trauma and paranoia coming back to bite him. Remember, Sadako doesn't appear in the flesh, only in Yoichi's nightmare, and his own trauma and desire to fight back against it does the rest. It shows that no matter how far he's come, it'll always be with him, and he can never be truly rid of it. It's a vicious cycle. Trauma feeding trauma in a never-ending circle. A ring. It's why I think Yoichi was literally the perfect choice as the survivor for the chapter, because Ringu is all about generational trauma and the guilt that comes with it. How it can overshadow your life and consume you so completely long after you think you've gotten past it. It's the theme that made the film so memorable, and that caused Razan to fail due to the absence of it. And Yoichi effectively imagining Sadako's involvement and projecting his fears of her onto the disappearances in Izu-Oshima and Scotland is the perfect manifestation of that theme. Don't get me wrong, I love Raiko as a character as much as the next man, and it's indisputable that her role in the original film cannot be replicated or understated. Nanako Matsushima put in a timeless performance, and I absolutely understand everyone who thinks Raiko is robbed by including the son as the survivor instead of her. But now that we have Yoichi and his story is as exhaustive and intelligently written as it is, I don't think Raiko could ever have contended with that. Having Raiko as a survivor of the Ringu chapter would have been fine. She's the obvious choice. But it's important to bear in mind that she died in the sequel, got splattered by a truck, and as a result her story is pretty much told by now. There's nothing more to really add to her because her entire involvement with Sadako is documented from the start to the finish. There wouldn't be any canon problems weaving her in as a survivor because the entity has taken people on the brink of death before. But I can't help but think it wouldn't accomplish anything except playing to the nostalgia of Ringu enjoyers, which, despite that kind of being the point of a licensed chapter in the first place, doesn't build at all on what you already have, only photocopying it. It's why I had such a big problem with how the Resident Evil characters were introduced into Dead by Daylight, because they're literally just Control-C, Control-V into the realm with no thought as to how they got there or how their arrival there affects them. It's just, okay, Jill, Leon, Nemesis are here now. That's nice. I can't help but feel Raiko would have been the same. There because fans want her to be there, not there because it adds something to her character or Ringu's overall themes by her presence. Yoichi, on the other hand, is a thematic home run for Ringu fans because of what he represents. What better way to explore generational trauma than to focus on the adult life of a child traumatised at a young age and how that trauma affected him growing up? He takes them after his parents to feel truly like Ryuji and Raiko's son while also being his own man. He's a scientist like his father and an investigator like his mother, but unlike his parents, he wants to master and learn more about his ESP powers rather than being hesitant to use them. And unlike them, he wants to confront the horrors of the world head on, rather than do what Raiko did in Ringu 2 and disappear off the face of the earth once the immediate danger had passed, requiring Mai and Takashi to actively hunt her down to find out what's going on. Yuichi almost goes too far the other way, if anything, letting his trauma destroy his life at the mere hint that the curse that killed his parents is still hanging over him. This isn't the first time behaviour has made brand new lore for existing licensed characters. Quentin and Cheryl both received longer stories that fleshed out the events in their lives after Nightmare on Elm Street and Silent Hill 3 respectively. And Detective Tapp got a ton of new lore in the Saw tome that I've talked about before at great length. But I think Yoichi has them all beaten except maybe Tapp's tome, because it's such a big jump between the end of Ringu 2 and the Yoichi we see in the fog. And yet the transition is completely natural, and fits both with Yoichi's established character and within the themes of the wider work. Maintaining thematic consistency with a work as complex, intelligent and culturally loaded as Ringu is very hard to do, especially for writers who aren't a part of that culture. But Yoichi demonstrates a level of cultural and source material awareness I wasn't expecting from the company that wrote the Amanda tome, for example. He is everything a licensed character could and should be. A part of Ringu's universe allowed to grow and be his own character within our little game without compromising any aspect of what came before, instead adding to it. If any piece of wider Ringu media, like another film for example, revisits Yuichi as an adult, it wouldn't surprise me if he became a marine biologist who investigates paranormal happenings around the world, because it's so natural from what the Ringu movies are already established about the character. In an interview with The Loadout, creative director at Behaviour Dave Richards had this to say about the design behind Yuichi. At the end of the day, our objective is that the content we create is truthful to the original IP and represents their universe in a Dead by Daylight way. There is no way you can convince me that Yoichi is anything but a rampant success by that metric. You can tell Kadokawa and Behaviour both cared a lot about how Yoichi and Ringu as a franchise was represented, and that's how licensed content in this game should always be. It can just be a heartless cash grab, but it deserves so much better than that. It's a coming together of icons past, a memorial to what they meant to audiences and still do today. Yoichi Asakawa is all of that and more, and I hope someday we see more of him, because something tells me his story has only just begun. Well, that's covered everything I had to say about Yoichi Asakawa, a character I wanted to talk about for a hell of a long time. What do you think? Would you have preferred to have Raiko or even Ryuji in the game? Or are you content with what we got? Either way, I'd love to know in the comments. While you're down there, feel free to subscribe if you haven't already so you never miss a future upload. And there are links in the description to check out my Discord server, my Twitter and my Twitch. Patrons got to view this video a day early, so if that sounds like something you're into, my Patreon link is down there as well. And thanks once again to Wraith Energy for their continued support. If you want to check them out then please do, they make some genuinely excellent drinks. And don't forget to use my code PIXEL20 for 20% off at checkout. Thanks so much for sticking around, and I'll see you in the next one. Ta-ta for now.